Hey, we're live. Welcome everybody to another edition of Self-Publishing Insiders. Today my guest is, and I've just realized, Doug, that I did not confirm the pronunciation of your last name. We were chatting backstage for like 15 minutes and
I could be quite distracting sometimes, so I'll take the onus for that. It's Vigliotti.
Vigliotti. Okay, well I would have gotten it correct, but probably mispronounced it, later. I'll mispronounce it later on in the conversation. Let me read your quick bio so everybody knows, who you are and why we're here. So my colleague here, my guest, Doug Vigliotti. See, I already screwed it up. It only took us 30 seconds. He's the author of 4 books, including Aristotle for Novelists and Tom Collins, a slightly crooked novel, which is available to listen on Slightly Crooked, Good Stories Told Well, which is a podcast that also features his raw and unorthodox poem collection, Mini Heartbreaks, or Little Poems About Life. Doug is also the host of Books for Men, a weekly podcast to inspire more men to read. Doug, thanks for joining us today.
It is my pleasure to join you.
Well, we're happy that you're here. So, but we're going to talk a bit about this book. Let me bring up the cover art here. We're here to talk about Aristotle for Novelists, 14 Timeless Principles on the Art of Story. I'll provide some links about this later on. But I'm interested, Doug, what led to your writing of this book? What led you to Aristotle in the first place, and especially the Poetics? Can you tell us why you wrote the book?
Yes, yeah, that's a really good question. So, as you alluded to in my brief bio there, I've written a number of books, and I started off in nonfiction. And when I started to consider writing fiction, I quickly realized that it was a whole different gambit, right? Like fiction is a much different thing than nonfiction. And fortunately, I've always had the ability or the penchant, I should say, to get words on a page. And so the thing that I really needed to learn how to tackle was story. And so when I started to do research on story specifically, I am breaking this up and mentioning writing and story as 2 different things, and I can elaborate that in a moment. But when I started to research story, I quickly realized that there wasn't that much out there in a direct fiction sense. So authors of fiction, I mean, and where there was more information on story were screenwriters. And even when you talk about craft books like Story by Robert McKee, which I'm sure most people have heard of, or Save the Cat, a lot of people have heard of that. All of those things are geared towards screenwriters. And, me being me, I started to dive into screenwriting and story in that form. And I started to read a lot of story books and work from screenwriters and filmmakers that I like David Mamet, Aaron Sorkin, Sidney Lumet, and even Robert, the Robert McKee book that I mentioned, was more of a technical book. But what I quickly realized as I started to really dive into this was everything funneled back to Aristotle. And so they would always reference Aristotle. They'd always be talking about Aristotle's Poetics.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so me being me, I was like, let me just read Poetics. And so then I read Poetics. I read multiple translations of Poetics. And what I've said this a couple of times, but what I quickly realized after that was that almost all dramatic structure, so the TV shows and the films that we see, they all relied on a lot of the principles that are in Poetics. And so I wrote a novel. I wrote a couple more novels. Time had passed. And this idea had kept bugging me on why isn't this packaged up in a way for novelists to consume? Because not only has it helped me, it's been influential in all of the stories that we watch on television to this day. For the last 2,000 years, 2,300 years, these principles have been baked into this storytelling. And why isn't it packaged up in a way for novelists? And so I ended up writing the novel, and I ended up writing the book, showing it to a couple of writing friends, and they were like, "Man, we got to get this out into the world. Like this needs to be into the hands of writers." And so that was how the book came to be.
Yeah, and kudos to you too, because the book is very well organized, and the structure is fantastic. But you still managed to get your voice. I love your writing voice. It's direct, but it's witty. And when you open the book, near the beginning of the book, anyway, I think it's in the introduction. You mentioned you're talking about story and writing, but something that you said that I love is story is why they come, writing is why they stay. So I love that, but can you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between story and writing? You've mentioned that there are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. So this all actually derives from my father, believe it or not. So
Mhm.
he has a saying that is, and you might recognize it as the subline of the Slightly Crooked podcast, and that is good stories told well. And what that implies is that there is a story and there is writing. And you can write something really well and tell a bad story. You can have a really great story that is written really poorly. I think we see this a lot in television because I could say that there's a lot of great stories out there that aesthetically, the style in which they're told just don't do it for me, but they're still great
Hmm.
stories.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think that the same applies to any writer of fiction. And I have no interest in telling a writer of fiction how to write their story. In fact, I want them to write it in the most unique way that is to their voice, with the most idiosyncrasies and style elements that they can
Yeah.
possibly bake into it.
Yep.
But I also want to point out that that's a lot different than story principles and what makes a story work. Because you could they're just one informs the other. So oftentimes style informs story, but story at its core has very specific things that, despite genre, romance, thriller, literary, horror,
Hmm.
there's things, life stories. Listen, my Jim's story, Doug's story, like there are elements of that are all very, very similar. And this is what I'm trying to point out in this book. And this is also why I think Aristotle had so much to say on the matter, because it was so intrinsically linked with life. Story was so intrinsically linked with life that it was something that was natural to elaborate on in more detail. And that's really what poetics is, in a sense. Well, let me backtrack. Poetics
Okay.
is Aristotle speaking on the nature of tragedies and epics. But I think what led him to that is the reason why he says we were drawn to storytelling so much, and that is because, one, imitation, and two, rhythm. So imitation being, we learn how to live through imitating. And
Hmm.
that's what a story is doing. It is imitating life. And so and rhythm being, we have a natural inclination for rhythm. And I think that most people can look at that as voice and tone and the meter of which you write. And so because of this intertwinement with life, I think that's what led Aristotle to this, to really be fascinated in this subject matter.
It's so interesting that you're talking about this now, this intertwinement with life, because when we were, backstage enjoying our snacks and our drinks, we were talking about traveling and our different travel experiences, and how no matter where you go, what you see, there are certain undeniable characteristics that we all share, whether it's like the universal language of a smile. So when I'm gleaning from what you're telling me here about Aristotle, is that the same holds true for storytelling. There are certain elements that you can write about whatever. Your story can be about could be within any genre, but there are certain elements that hold true across them that we need to pay attention to. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, 100%. And so at its core, if we think about Western storytelling, so
Hmm.
there's a little bit, it's a little different if we look at Eastern storytelling, um, but Western storytelling, which is pretty much anything from ancient Greek on, and this includes life stories, life on the screen, on the page, story in general. There are three elements that exist, and that is a protagonist, and we'll use me or Jim. We're both protagonists who want something. What does Jim want? What does Doug want? And there are obstacles standing in our way. Those obstacles come in the form of external and internal. Jim has them, Doug has them, depending on whatever he wants. Does Doug or Jim overcome those obstacles? Well, then we have a comedy. He ends up better off. Does Doug or Jim succumb to those obstacles? He ends up worse off. That's a tragedy. So why does a tragedy work if the protagonist ends up worse off? And that's because in most tragedies, there's something bigger happening, and there's a truth being availed to the reader or to the viewer. We want to see, like a headache that needs to subside. We want to see that truth be availed for what it actually is. We want to see justice served. So we have maybe the protagonist ending worse off, but because he ends up worse off, we learn an inevitable truth about life. And that's why most tragedies actually still work. Now, the comedy works because it's obvious. Jim or Doug overcomes those obstacles and everyone
Yeah.
goes home happy. That's 95% of stories in genre fiction or in genre TV, they're comedies, right? Even if,
Hmm.
I don't mean laugh, haha, I mean, the protagonist ends up saving the day.
Yeah, there's a happy ending, or
It's a happy ending. I don't want to say it's harder to tell a tragedy. It's just not as, there's so much great art that is tragic, art that I love that
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
could share with you and share with you now. It's just from a commerce standpoint, it's easier to sell a comedy than it is to sell a tragedy, because the execution of
Sure.
a tragic work has to be so tight and so good, because you're dealing with a protagonist who's not going to get what they want, essentially, and
Okay.
they're going to fall victim to their flaws. That's what a Greek tragedy is, right? A Greek tragedy is the fatal flaw. So Jim's flaw and Doug's flaw, we don't overcome it.
I've
Instead,
got some big flaws.
yeah, so do I. So do I. Like talking too
Fill
much, right?
volumes.
Like talking too much. I could talk it could be my downfall if I'm not careful. Uh, um, but what ends up happening is that it's usually a strength, right? And so it's a strength that then becomes a weakness because it's amplified to a certain point, and then it becomes the downfall of that character. So you can look at that in a book that I love, that I always share when I'm talking about tragedies, is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. A lot of people have
Hmm.
read it. It's a perfect example of what happens when, like, the father is the protagonist of that story, and anyone who hasn't read it, I'm going to spoil it. The father
Hmm.
dies, and why is it okay that at the end of that story that the father dies? Because what we learn is a big truth about life, that all humans die, and now the boy has to go on and live life on his own. That's it. That is a truth about life. And so even though it doesn't end happily, we're so satisfied with that ending, because it's like, oh, of course, like,
It
that's the
still
truth.
delivers. It delivers something
It delivers
tangible.
something even bigger
Yeah.
than it resolves itself even bigger than it would be if the father found a way to figure it out. But also the arc of that story would be different, right? Because when you have a tragedy, you've got to get
Mhm.
that to an ultimate high, so that way it could fall. Whereas in the comedy, most people are, in a story that ends well, it comes down into an ultimate low. And that ultimate low, then they rise from that. And that usually what most people in storytelling, or whether screenwriting or on the page, and I say fiction, that's usually like third act, right? Where the third act starts. It's where it's called plot point 2, where like a character is at their absolute lowest point or at their absolute highest point. We see another example for a tragedy where the character would be at their highest point before they fall, would be like classic, would be like Wall Street, Bud Fox. He's riding high, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's got to fall. Or or The Secret History, Richard Papin. He's like he becomes complicit in a murder because he's falling victim to his flaw of lying to try to fit into this group that he doesn't fit into. And because
Okay.
he's lying to fit in, they end up murdering somebody, and now he's complicit in this murder. And so he's all of a sudden he's fitting in, and then and he's having this, like he's reached the goal that he wants to achieve, but then they murder somebody, and how he has to deal with the outcome of that. And so that falls. And of course, that story is teaching you a lesson of, well, don't lie to try to fit in, just
Okay.
be who
Okay.
you
I'm
are.
getting this here.
So those are tragic arcs, but comedic arcs are pretty simple, right? Because it's you go to the bottom, and then they end up rising and getting the girl, beating the bad guy.
Yeah.
Now they can deliver just as much emotional, um, emotional. What's the word I'm looking for? I mean, one of my favorite movie of all time is Rocky, and Rocky is a
Mhm.
comedy, right? It's got a comedic structure. But yeah, I mean, I've kind of given a general
There are
overview of
definitely values in there. There are definitely traumas in that storyline,
yes.
that he's got to dig out of.
Yeah, well, ultimately, like that story is, ultimately that story is Rocky. So most people think that's a winning and losing story, right? They think that's a story about winning and losing, and it's an underdog story. But that story,
Mhm.
that's not the backbone of that. The backbone of that story is love. It's love for himself, and then love for the girl.
Mhm.
And it all rides on that flaw and that deficiency that he has as a character. And it sounds really crappy to say what I'm going to say, but as a character, if you watch Rocky one, what he's dealing with is he's dumb. And I know that sounds like harsh, but that's how they wrote the character.
That's how they wrote the character. Yeah.
That's how Sylvester Stallone writes that character. He's dumb, and he has low self-esteem, and the world is beating him down. And even the people in his life who are on his team, Mickey, Paulie, they all are obstacles that are in his way from achieving the thing that he really wants, which is to increase that self-esteem and to prove to the world that he could do it. So they look like they're on his team,
With
but
the
they're all
tools that he has, which is almost nothing.
but they're saying to him, "You can't do it. You're a bum, Rock. You can't do
Yeah.
it." And so he ends up, the arc of that story is when he's down in his dumps, and then down in the dumps, and then he comes out of it to prove that he can do it, right?
Right.
That he can go 15 rounds with the champ. And this hits on another actual aspect of Aristotelian storytelling, because the fact that he doesn't win in Rocky 1 actually helps that story even more. And it does because it hits on something that Aristotle is super, super insistent about, and that is stories need to be believable.
Yeah, that's one of the principles, right? Is that
Yes,
one of the? Okay.
need to be.
Let me stop you just for a
Go, go, go,
second.
go, go.
Just for a second.
I get passionate about this, and I could just keep talking about it. So please interject at
Well,
any
same here.
point.
I'm totally into to our conversation. Like Lexi will tell you, I get so into these conversations sometimes. I'm like, yeah, and then and I stop paying attention to the comments and the questions. But I wanted to ask you. So there are 14 principles in the book. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what if I'm a pantser? Like, there's all this structure, and the book itself, your book itself, it's so structured and it's so organized. But let's say I'm a pantser and I'm starting to feel like a little anxious. Um, do these principles, are they going to put me into a box? Does this for pansters too?
Yeah, so I'm really happy you asked this question because it's something that I usually like to get out of the way early. There's a couple things I like to
Okay.
get out of the way early. One, how I came to it, which was great because you asked it. Two, the difference between writing and story. We talked about that. And the third
Okay.
piece is this idea of pantsers versus plotters, because I know that in the fiction world, you could be in two different camps. And I think that a lot of people are probably hybrids. And I'm not even,
That's a good point itself, but go on.
yeah. And so I'm not even suggesting that you need to utilize these principles to craft your story. I'm suggesting that you take these principles and you look at the story after you wrote it and see if they exist within it. And if
Mm,
they exist within it, then there's a pretty good chance you're telling a working story. Because there's a most pantsers, what they have figured out are things like believability, logic, cohesiveness. Um, they've figured out all of these things that Aristotle talks about intuitively. And when you go back and you look at this
yeah.
story, when you go back and you look at the story, you're going to say, "Oh yeah, these are in there. This is in there." Because that's what makes up a working story. It's not that you have to build it with it. It's that when you go and you look at the story, you will see that these things are actually in there. And that's what Aristotle was so genius about, was pointing this stuff out. Now, I do want to make it clear that I adapted that work to fit novelists. So he didn't say novels need to be believable. Well, actually, he did say he basically did say that as far as possible, all stories should be believable. So he did say that directly, but
Yeah.
he uses words like probable, necessary, needed, likely, and all he's talking about in there is believability. Are you doing what this character would do, or are you making up
Mm,
what they might do? Like
yeah.
these are the type of things. And so I don't want to get too far off the beaten path here, but to go back to what you were originally saying, absolutely not. I mean, absolutely, this book would be helpful to people who are pantsers because it's not telling you. One of the things that really drove me nuts when I was learning how to tell story was this idea that there was a plug and play template. Now, I know that there's a lot of formulas that work for a lot of people, whether with some of the stuff I mentioned, Save the Cat, or there's other things but for me, I just find that to be totally restrictive. I found it easier to learn like what is really baked inside of a working story,
Hmm.
and see if I could build stories, and then if that stuff is actually in my story, rather than saying I must do this on page 4, I must do this on page
Yeah.
12. Now I know for screenwriting that is really important because one, you're dealing with a lot more money. You're trying to get stuff made, and so each page represents time on the screen, and that
It's
equates
so
to,
condensed.
yeah, and that creates actual dollars that need to be like equated to film that and to produce that movie or that play, right? And so you can't
Yep.
drone on and on. Novels are a little different, right? Now Aristotle is makes the point of saying that things need to be essential, and they should be essential. Your scenes, your chapters, everything should be essential to your story. But as a fiction writer, because keep in mind, when Aristotle was talking about this stuff, there was no novels yet. So he was talking about, poetics. I think that he would include it under poetics if he was alive today,
Hmm.
but he wasn't specifically talking about writers of fiction. And so when I look at actually writing fiction and talking to other fiction writers, I realize that there is a little bit more leeway and a little bit it's a little bit looser of a structure. I tend to still think that you should be pretty tight, but I totally understand that there's a lot of leeway there. And yeah, I took that question and really ran with it. So
Well,
I apologize.
not at all. No, I was going to say, like, well, in your book, you're talking about structure, but you also come right out and say, and I think it's toward the beginning where you're like, hey, I'm not going to tell you how to do your art. Like, your art is your art. Like, you're the artist here. And if anybody tells you that it has to be a certain way, like this is the way, then turn the other way and run. So you are giving permission for writers of fiction to have that
It is
space.
it is really important to me that writers and artists are allowed to create the art and write the books that they want to write. That is an overriding theme in my belief system
Hmm.
that I will never waver from. I think that it's really important that artists and writers are allowed to do that and are able to do that. And I think one of the big things that I was thinking when I was writing this book, this wasn't just for writers necessarily. This was for anybody who was looking to critique stories, was understanding the difference between writing and story. Because I don't think that a lot of people approach stories that way. And because of that, they don't give things a chance, or they don't have a framework to really grasp why they don't like something or why they do like something. And instead they just say, oh, that's like trash, or that's, I have this conversation all the time. I read all across the literary spectrum, literary fiction, genre fiction, and I think there's a place for all of it, but you have to have the language to describe why this works or this doesn't work,
Yep.
or and I think that I was just hoping to make that easier for people with a book like this that breaks down a lot of those different sections.
Yeah. I want to bring up this comment here from one of our viewers who I think just kind of underscores what you were talking about just a little bit earlier. Layla says, even in a fantasy, there's still totally an importance in being believable with the logic of your world.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I think that believability, and I've been in a few conversations with writers about this concept about believability in the past. And the thing that I always say is the elephant can be orange. You just have to convince us. I am not talking about fact versus fiction. I'm talking about
Hmm.
believability. Do I believe what you are selling me? Do I buy that your character would actually do this? Those are all things that have nothing to do with whether you're writing realism, surrealism, fantasy. Uh, it just, am I buying it? I say this in the book, and it's true. When I engage with any art, I ask myself usually two questions. And the first one is, do I believe it? That's the number one question.
Hmm.
If I don't believe it, I don't want to keep going. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be real. It just means I have to buy what the author is selling me, or I have to buy what the musician is selling me. If I think you're just up there as a show pony and there's no authenticity to what you're doing, I'm not buying it, and I'm not going to keep listening, or I'm not going to keep tuning in. The second question.
Hallelujah, brother. I'm right there with you with that.
And the
Yeah,
second
you could.
question is, do I want more of it? Right. So it ends up being, do I believe it? And do I want more of it? And I think that that's a reasonable question we can ask about our work as we're creating it.
Okay, thank you for that. You know, we've heard from authors who, maybe they've tried to go down the traditional route and publishers are telling them, hey, we like your story, but it's just way too long or it's way too short in some cases. Um, what is the appropriate length for a novel? I think you lay it out in the book, but can you explain what you mean by that? Like, what does it mean exactly for a novel to have an appropriate length?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think it's important for, again, to underscore the idea that you could write the novel however long you want to write it. If you're going to go
Mhm.
self-publish it, and you could write it however you could. Even if you want to go traditional, you could write it however long you want it. Now,
Hmm.
does that mean you're going to have some friction and some objections, as you pointed out? You might. And there's a couple reasons for this before I get into the actual length. One
Okay.
being a big thing that I started to talk about earlier when I was talking about rhythm, but in a macro sense, there's, as all writers know, the pacing of a novel, right? And if your novel is really long, and most novels in the genre you're writing aren't that long. So say you're writing a mystery novel and you have a mystery novel that's 130,000 words.
Hmm.
Now, most mystery novels are around 80,000 words, 90,000 words. That means you have a novel that is 40 to 50,000 words longer than the average. I instantly want to know why, because unless it's radically different than anything else, I'm going to wager that you have 40 to 50,000 words of fat in that novel that could be cut. Because going back to what I was just saying, the central storyline of most stories, even in sprawling character studies, are a protagonist who wants something with obstacles standing in their way. How much do you deviate from that? Well, if you watch a screenplay, if you watch a movie, they're not deviating from that too much. In fact, the best ones stay really tight to that. Novels, same thing. Now, a lot of times they deviate, and they'll deviate from that storyline, but it's important to know how far you're deviating from it. And I think that when you get into longer novels, it's much easier to start deviating much farther away from your central storyline. Now, that could be effective in the right hands, but most times it would probably be better served if you reduced it and got things tighter to that central storyline. So pacing becomes an issue if you have a novel that's too long. It could be the same as you have a novel too short, but
Hmm.
it's much better to have a shorter novel than it is to have a longer novel, because at least you have the problem of, well, we can always add to it, or you have the leave them wanting more, right? Like
Okay.
that is a
Sure.
but
But the audience is expecting. So if I'm hearing you correctly, over time, audience have grown to expect certain genres to be a certain way. So you don't want to
certainly
go too far out, off the guardrails there. But at the same time, you can use your creativity, sprinkle in your own creativity, your own spice in your particular genre to make it your own.
that. And also, if you have an understanding of how long you want the novel, it becomes a little bit easier for construction. Now, I'm not here to tell anybody how to write their story, but from my own experience,
Hmm.
knowing if you have a novel that's 80,000 words, let's say, which is
Hmm.
to me like a perfect length for a novel. Now, I like a lot of shorter novels. Longer novels, they become a much tougher sell for me. Um, but I still read plenty of them. But 80,000, let's say, is the sweet spot. If you know that, then you know relatively that you're going to want to spend about 25% of that in your first act, 50% of it in your second act, and 25% of it in your third act. So, how long is it taking you to get out of that first act? How long are you staying in that second act? And how
Yep.
long is your third act? Right? When people say, "Oh, that story just didn't move too well," well, what they're really saying is couldn't get out of the first act. The first act was entirely too long. In the first act, it's important to know that when your first act ends to when your second act starts, because the first act is the world as we know it. It's the world as we see it right now. It's nothing has happened. I mean, things happen. You have inciting incident, all that, all those things that people talk about when they're talking about three-act structure. But the second act is when you enter a new world and all the problems start happening. So
Gotcha.
it's like, you know, a lot of people describe it as the protagonist getting what they want, but there's a catch that they now
Hmm.
have to deal with in order to actually achieve the
Okay.
goal that they're trying to get, right? So, I don't know. It could be so many different things. Um,
No, that's fine. That's fine.
yeah, but the long and the short of it is that if you know the length, it also becomes easier for construction, and also going back to the traditional piece, they expect certain lengths with certain genres, and if you really are serious about going that route, you have to really consider strongly how long or short your novel is, because they're not going to look at the project. Like, they literally
Gotcha.
won't, because everybody in that industry, the publishing industry, is overwhelmed, and believe it or not, they have so many projects that are coming at them that there are certain disqualifiers that they won't even look at your project for, and one of them is a genre, a length that's too long for its genre. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just an
we
instant.
cover that from time to time on the show here. We about all the slush pile, and
I could
that's
also, oh, sorry, I could also talk about the actual, like, Aristotle's definition for what a proper length of a story is too. So Aristotle
sure.
says that the upper limit should be what's reasonably held in the reader's mind's eye. So if you're going past what someone would reasonably be able to hold in their mind's eye, then you are you know you're too long. And this is why at the end of Poetics, he actually concludes that tragedies are better formed than epics. And one of the major reasons why he says that is because of length. And the bottom level is, how long does it take for your protagonist to make that change? So we talked about Rocky going through that change. We talked about, um,
You've got to hold the reader and get them
yeah,
to turn that next page.
Bud Fox. We talked about Bud Fox making that arc. How long does it take for Bud Fox's arc to be negative? How long does it take for Rocky's arc to go positive? Whatever the reasonable and least amount of time it takes to get
Hmm.
that done, that is your bottom level of the spectrum. So your top is what's reasonable to hold in your mind's eye, and the bottom level is how long it takes for that arc. That's not, people aren't satisfied with that answer, because it's not saying the novel should be 80,000 words or the novel should be 90,000 words. We're talking more macro with that kind of stuff.
No, I think that's good. I don't want people to feel like, oh, I have to edit out, 1,500 words or whatever, because this is what my story requires. I need this extra buffer here to get my points across or to tell my story properly. I want to ask you, the
Yes.
chain of causality. It keeps coming up in the book. What is that? Can you describe that? Chain of causality.
Yeah, of course. So chain of causality, you talked about pantsers and you talked about plotters before.
Hmm.
And one of the big reasons why pantsers don't need to pay attention to anything that I'm talking about, and why they at least in stories that work, is because they figured out this one concept. They figured out chain of causality. And chain of causality is that basically everything happens via cause and effect. And if going back to what we really started this whole conversation with, where I said Aristotle was so interested in this because of its intertwinement with life,
Hmm.
let's talk about how life works, how life unfolds. And life doesn't unfold with everything just randomly happens, but a lot of stuff randomly does happen, but they're all caused by something that happened before it. So I came on this podcast. Something is going to happen because we're having this conversation. I don't know what. Maybe I'll never know, but maybe somebody who's listening will write something, and then that will spawn something else. That's cause and effect. And
Hmm.
that's how life unfolds. It unfolds one thing happens, therefore the next thing happens. And it maybe happens sporadically in like buckshot, but it happens that way. Now, when you're streamlining that down into a story, your story should unfold in a cause and effect way. So if Doug walks into the room, the reader wants to know what happens when Doug walks into the room. They don't care what happens outside on the street unless what's happening outside on the street informs what's happening when Doug walks into that room.
And it also goes back to the believability. We talked about that
100%.
at the very beginning.
And so, you know, Aristotle is insistent when he says there's a difference between something happening because of something and something happening after something. And it's the because of, right? This happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens. You want to avoid ands. This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this. That's not cause and effect. Cause and effect is this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens. Pantsers are great at that because that's how they make an engaging story, but they don't know. They may not have the language for it, but they definitely have the skill and the ability to do it because they do it, you know, and what really amps that tension is a strategy, again, that Aristotle talks about in this book. He talks about what's called recognitions and reversals. Again, something that pantsers do extremely well. This happens, but this happens. See the but? The but is the reversal. It's the little bit of tension. So Doug walks into the room, but his girlfriend is waiting for him on the other side. Oh, well, what's going to happen now? They have a conversation, and his mistress is called, you know, it's like there's a but that juxtaposes everything. But this happens, but this happens, but this happens, but this happens. That's how TV shows are written. It's just constant reversal, 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 reversal. If you go into
a little bit of tension.
It's tension. That's how you create tension. And if you go and you type into YouTube now, South Park, Matt Trey, Matt Stone, and what's his name? The other guy, Trey Parker or something?
Trey Parker, I think. Yeah.
They have a great little 3-minute video on the power of but and using but to create South Park. But it's to create all TV shows because that's how TV shows are written. And Aristotle, amazingly, talked about this 2,300 years ago when he was talking about reversals. Now, he wasn't talking about it in the language they are, but it's the same exact thing. It's the same exact concept. And so going back to what you were saying, the chain of causality is really important because it links everything together, whether you're using a but or a therefore. What you want to avoid is and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Now,
go ahead.
I don't know. I was going to put in a caveat there, but I don't want to confuse everybody.
Well, I wanted to ask, we got like a minute and a half left. So I wanted to ask you, can you spend a minute talking about the clarity ambiguity spectrum? And I feel like you were kind of leading toward that as you were speaking there.
Yes. So this gets more into style, and it also gets more into what type of story you are telling, right? And I think when you're writing something, whether you have the language for it or not, you're operating on what I call the clarity and ambiguity spectrum. And some works of art are way more ambiguous and some are way clearer. In the book, I talk about songs to draw an example of this. And in the book, I say, I Won't Back Down by Tom Petty is a lot different than Mr. Tambourine by Bob Dylan. One is relying on ambiguity. One is relying on clarity. They should be obvious. I Won't Back Down is clear. Mr. Tambourine Man is ambiguous. It's important that you know which one of those makes your writing work. right? How clear is this? How clear do I want it to be? It could work on both ends of the spectrum, but it's important to know that everything that you're writing with, style-wise, is landing somewhere on that spectrum. Now, if we're talking about, say, like dialogue specifically, super clear, super ambiguous. How clear is it? How clear do you want it to be? What type of reader do you have? Does it matter? Does it not matter? These are all style questions that one would have to answer. But this gets into a more style thing, and I will end this with saying that the one thing Aristotle is super insistent about when it comes to style is that moderation is key. So no matter
Yeah.
what you do, if you're going to use that salt, you're going to use that pepper, make sure you're moderating carefully because too much of anything can be a bad thing.
That's wisdom for life. You've got the subheader of the book is 14 timeless principles on the art of story, but you've got a 15th principle in the book, which is your own. So I wanted to end the conversation with this question: what is that 15th principle that you added?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really happy that you asked this because it kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying before about how one of the central writing themes for me is that artists and writers should be able to create the art and write the books that they want to create. And in the 15th principle, this is something that Aristotle didn't say, but it's something that I'm insistent about, and that is that all novelists, because I code all of the principles as novels should be, or in
Yeah.
the 15th principle, it's novelists should, and it's read or write, read, and have courage. And I say that because it's impossible to be a writer and not write. That is the definition of what a writer is. You don't have to be published. You don't have to be published. You don't have to be. Can you write today? If you write today, then you are a writer, and so you can't replace that. Writing is going to be the surest thing for you to get better at whatever you're doing. Reading is the 1A because it teaches you to know what you like and what you don't like. And hopefully, if you read this book, it'll give you language to understand on a maybe even a little deeper level what you're reading, and be able to parse out some of the things that you may like or don't like. I advocate that all writers be their own critics. If not, they don't have to be public critics, but their own critic and have their own little. I mean, Aristotle was insistent about this, saying that novels can be criticized based on very specific things. And I'll save that for anybody who wants to pick up the book. I won't spoil it right now. But that third piece of the 15th principle is courage. And this goes hand in hand with what I was saying before. After you write and you read and you're penning your story, you have to be courageous. You have to write the story that needs to be written in the style that it needs to be written. All great art, whether it was created on the fringes, in the mainstream, it doesn't matter. It required an element of courage. The writer had to write the story that way. And there's a great quote in the book that is from the filmmaker Alejandro Inarritu, and he says, "One must have the courage to be disliked." And that is, to me, some of the best advice you can ever get, because the willingness to be liked is like although it may work in the real world, it's easier to navigate on the page, pushing the boundaries and writing the story the way it needs to be written in the style that it should be written in. Going back to artists need to be able to tell the stories that they need to tell, and the writers should write the books the way they need to write. It requires you to piss some people off because not everyone's going to like your art. It's just the way that it is.
I'm so happy that you mentioned courage, because as artists, whether you're a musician, a sculptor, or an author, when you create art, you're pulling something out of your heart and soul, and you're putting it out there for the world. That's terrifying. That's terrifying to show your most intimate inner workings out there. But for authors, I can almost guarantee you that that moment you click publish, or that moment you get that book published, it's also a sense of relief. You just feel this weight come off your shoulders. I did it, and you can all do it.
The Aristotle has a great quote about courage, and it's in Nicomachean Ethics, and he says, and I'm going to paraphrase him. He says, you know, courage is a virtue. That's, you know, something that he talks about. But he says it's a dance between fear and confidence. Fear is expected. Confidence is required. Courage is somewhere in the middle of those two things. So one is going to be afraid, but the necessary balance to that is the confidence to do it anyway. And he talks about, if you're not afraid, that's a big problem. And if you're, you know, too confident, that's a big problem. If you're so afraid that you have no confidence, that's a big problem. Courage is in the middle of those two things. It's a spectrum. It's like it goes hand in hand with what he would call the golden mean. But anyway, we'll leave it on that. I don't want to go.
No, that's perfect. Growth is on the other side of that fear. If you are interested in this book, and I think you all should be, check it out. You could check it out at Doug's website, AristotleForNovelists.com. And Doug, you've got like all your contact information and everything there if people want to get in touch with you and ask you some questions and that sort of thing as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So on that website, that's just a page on my website, which is DouglasVigliotti.com, where I have a contact. My email is listed right on my website. Please feel free to email me. I'm available to answer any questions. I love talking about this stuff. And if someone really wants to connect with me, I only have one social media platform. It's Instagram, and it's at Douglas Vigliotti. And I'm more than happy to chat in the DMs there as well, if it's easier for somebody.
Well, we loved having you. Just wanted to remind our guests out there, number one, you know, thanks for being here, everybody, and tuning in and week out. And I saw some new names out there hanging out in the comments, so welcome. If you enjoyed what Doug had to say today, if you could do us a solid and share and subscribe to our channel here, we really appreciate it, because that enables us to get excellent guests like Doug onto the show. If you want to see what's coming up next on Self-Publishing Insiders, be sure to bookmark D2D Live. As a matter of fact, check this out, everybody. So next week on March 27th, we are going to be celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the merger between Draft to Digital and Smashwords. So we'll have Chris Austin, who is the CEO of Draft to Digital, on the show, along with Mark Coker, the former CEO of Smashwords, who is now the Chief Strategy Officer. They'll both be here talking about what's going on post-merger, the plans for the companies, and, you know, some of the things that they are the most proud of following that merger. And finally, for those of you who may be just dipping your toes into the self-publishing waters, you can sign up for a free Draft to Digital account simply by going to draft2digital.com. Doug, I want to thank you once again for, you know, reaching out in the first place, but spending some of your time and expertise and talking about the book. And congratulations. I think you did a fantastic job with the book. And I love the voice in the book. I love the flow and that wit that you interject throughout.
I appreciate the comments and you including me on this broadcast. And I hope everybody writes the story that they want to write, and this helps them do that.
We appreciate it. Well, we're going to sign off for now. We hope to see you all here next week. Doug, hang out backstage. We'll have a quick chat. Enjoy some of the hors d'oeuvres back there. I'll be right there. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Ebooks are great, but there's just something about having your words in print. Something you can hold in your hands, put on a shelf, sign for a reader. That's why we created D2D Print, a print-on-demand service that was built for you. We have free, beautiful templates to give your book a pro look, and we can even convert your ebook cover into a full wraparound cover for print. So many options for you and your books. And you can get started right now at draftedigital.com.